3 weeks ago, my son David had been severely injured outside a nightclub downtown. Head trauma, internal injuries, the kind of damage that turned 22-year-old futures into medical charts and intensive care, that transformed bright young men into patients fighting for recovery. I knew the terminology by heart. I'd explained these exact injuries to countless families over my career, had delivered the careful, measured words that wrapped catastrophe in clinical distance. Significant trauma, guarded prognosis. We'll know more in the coming days. But when the neurologist Dr. Patel, a competent woman with kind eyes and steady hands of her own, had spoken those same words to me, they landed like blows. Each syllable a small violence, each pause a chasm of possibility. The police had shrugged with practiced indifference. Detective Morrison, no relation to Jake, despite the shared surname that had made my heart stutter when she'd introduced herself, had treated David's case like an item on a grocery list. Another night, another fight, another file that would collect dust until someone more important got hurt. "Kids don't talk," she'd said, her voice carrying the bureaucratic fatigue of someone who'd given this speech too many times, especially when alcohol's involved. "These club fights, they're always the same. Everybody sees nothing. Nobody knows nothing." But I was a surgeon. I understood anatomy, patterns, cause and effect. I understood that when the system failed, sometimes you had to operate with your own hands. Sometimes you had to cut away the diseased tissue yourself, even if it meant stepping outside the sterile boundaries of proper procedure. I'd started my investigation the way I approached surgery, methodically, precisely, with exhaustive preparation. Hours spent reviewing security footage from businesses near the club, frame-by-frame analysis that revealed nothing but shadows and inconclusive silhouettes. Days mapping the social networks of every witness, tracking down names through social media, following digital breadcrumbs through Instagram posts and Snapchat stories that painted pictures of young lives intersecting in moments of casual violence. The investigation had consumed me the way surgery once had. I'd converted David's childhood bedroom into a makeshift incident room, covering the walls with photographs, timelines, social media printouts connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's fevered dream. Susan's decorating magazines had been replaced by witness statements. David's old baseball trophies now shared shelf space with surveillance photos and police reports. I'd learned things about my son's social circle that made my surgeon's stomach turn. Tommy Reeves had 3 assault charges, 2 dismissed on technicalities, 1 plea bargain down to community service. Marcus Webb had been arrested twice for underage drinking, once for possession of marijuana. The group David had chosen to run with was a collection of angry young men with anger management problems and parents who solved problems with money rather than accountability. The deeper I dug, the more I understood how completely I'd failed to know my son. David's Instagram revealed a double life, carefully curated photos of study sessions and family dinners, presented for his parents' consumption, alternating with dark posts about fake people and haters and the need to show weakness who's boss. The boy who'd once volunteered at animal shelters had started posting photos of himself at underground fight clubs, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked disturbingly like bloodlust. Jake Morrison's social media told a different story. His posts had grown increasingly concerned, increasingly distant from David's circle. Photos that once showed the 2 boys together became increasingly solo shots. Status updates that referenced being tired of drama and needing better influences. Jake had been trying to save himself from David's orbit. I realized he'd been the smart one, the one who'd seen where David's path was leading and tried to get off before the inevitable crash. But he'd also been the coward who'd stayed close enough to get dragged into David's final disaster, who'd stood by and watched as his childhood friend got severely injured, who'd chosen his own safety over 14 years of friendship. The security footage from the night of the attack had taken me 2 weeks to obtain. Business owners were reluctant to share surveillance without police involvement, but money and sob stories had eventually opened doors. What I'd seen in those grainy, poorly lit videos had destroyed the last of my illusions about my son's innocence. David hadn't been a victim of random violence. He'd been the instigator, the aggressor, the young man who'd started a confrontation he couldn't finish. The footage showed him being confrontational and aggressive, even making the first physical move against someone who appeared much smaller than David's athletic frame. What followed had been swift and overwhelming, but it hadn't been unprovoked. Multiple individuals had taken David down, but it had been David who'd escalated the situation from words to physical confrontation. David who'd crossed a line from verbal argument to something more serious. And through it all, Jake Morrison had stood frozen, his face a mask of terror and indecision, watching his best friend get destroyed while he remained safely outside the circle of violence. The investigation had led me to Marcus Webb through a process of elimination that felt scientific in its precision. Witness statements, social media analysis, and careful surveillance had pointed to the skinny 19-year-old as one of the three who'd actually hit David. Marcus had been the easiest target, no money for good lawyers, no family connections to protect him, no social media presence sophisticated enough to cover his tracks. I had watched him for days, learning his routines with the patience of a surgeon preparing for a complex procedure. Marcus worked nights at the Shell station, came home exhausted, slept until afternoon, repeated the cycle with the mechanical precision of someone whose life had no room for variation or surprise. He was poor, isolated, and vulnerable, the perfect target for my need to balance the scales of justice. But Marcus had also been innocent, at least of the crime I had been prepared to punish him for. The revelation that he'd been just another scared kid caught up in someone else's violence had shattered my careful plans and forced me to confront the possibility that justice wasn't something I could deliver with surgical precision. The apartment building on Elm Street squatted against the night sky like a tumor, its brick facade stained with years of neglect and urban decay. I had been watching for 3 days, memorizing routines, studying the rhythms of my target's life with the same attention to detail I had once reserved for surgical protocols. Marcus Webb, 19 years old, worked nights at a Shell station on Route 9, the kind of place that attracted desperate customers at desperate hours. Gas, cigarettes, lottery tickets, and dreams deferred. He lived in Unit 4B with a girlfriend who left every morning at 7:15 sharp, her waitress uniform wrinkled, her face already wearing the weary expression of someone who knew exactly how her day would unfold. I knew these details the way I knew the layers of human tissue, with surgical precision born of obsessive observation. I knew that Marcus bought his groceries at the discount market on Tuesdays, that he smoked Marlboro Reds on the building's fire escape, that he dropped out of community college last semester with a 1.8 GPA and $17,000 in student debt. I knew that Marcus Webb had been at the club that night, that he'd been part of the group that had confronted David, that he'd been involved in the incident, maybe the one that had caused David's injuries when he fell. The lock on 4B surrendered to my credit card after 30 seconds of gentle manipulation. Another skill you learn, I mused, when you stop believing in proper channels. YouTube University had taught me more useful techniques in the past 3 weeks than medical school had in 4 years. The apartment reeked of poverty and desperation, cigarettes and cheap takeout, unwashed laundry and broken dreams. The carpet was stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the couple next door arguing about money, their voices rising and falling like a dysfunctional symphony. Marcus Webb was sleeping on a mattress on the floor, no bed frame, covers tangled around his legs like surgical gauze, thin, pale, younger than I had expected, the kind of kid who probably got picked on in high school. who might have joined David's crowd hoping to finally belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than his own small, circumscribed life. There was something almost pathetic about him in sleep, mouth slightly open, hair mussed, one hand flung across his chest like he was pledging allegiance to nothing. This was the monster who'd nearly killed my son. This boy, who looked like he couldn't intimidate a librarian. I positioned myself beside the makeshift bed and held the scalpel where Marcus could see it, the blade catching the dim light from the hallway. For a moment, I marveled at how far I'd fallen from the man who'd once sworn to do no harm. The instrument that had saved countless lives now represented something I barely recognized in myself. "Don't move," I whispered, my voice carrying the same calm authority I used in the operating room. "Don't make any sudden movements. We're going to have a conversation." Marcus's eyes snapped open, wild, white, terrified. The pupils dilated with pure fear, and his body went rigid with the realization that he was no longer alone. I could sense his terror, the sharp breathing, the trembling, the unmistakable awareness of someone caught completely vulnerable. "You remember David Chun?" My voice remained conversational, the tone I used to explain procedures to nervous patients, to walk families through the stages of their loved one's recovery. Professional, controlled, deadly. My son, 22 years old, pre-med student at State. "You remember what happened to him 3 weeks ago?" I don't. Marcus's voice cracked like thin ice, the words barely audible around his fear. The scalpel moved slightly closer, just enough to make my presence felt without crossing dangerous lines. "I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to my boy. Then you're going to tell me exactly what you remember. If our stories don't match..." I let the sentence hang in the air with heavy implication. But as I began to speak, something shifted in Marcus's face. Not guilt, not recognition, something worse. Something that made my surgeon instincts scream warnings I didn't want to hear. Confusion. Genuine bone-deep confusion. "David Chun?" Marcus whispered, his voice gaining strength even as his body remained perfectly still. "The Asian kid? From the club?" "That's right. But I wasn't even..." Marcus began sobbing then, great shuddering gasps that made his whole body shake. The tears came fast and honest, the kind of crying that couldn't be faked. "I swear to God, I never touched him. I was there when it started, but I ran. I'm a coward, okay? I admit it. But I never hit anyone." My hand didn't waver, but something cold crawled up my spine like surgical steel. I'd been so sure, so methodical in my investigation. The witness statements, the social media posts, the careful timeline I'd constructed. "You're lying," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I'm not, please." The words tumbled out between sobs, desperate and raw. It was Tommy who started it, Tommy Reeves. He's the one who threw the first punch. And David's friend, that big guy, Jake something, he just watched it happen. Didn't even try to help. Just stood there and let it happen. Jake. The name hit me like cardiac arrest, stopping my heart for a beat that lasted forever. Jake Morrison. David's best friend since elementary school. The kid who'd eaten dinner at our table every Sunday for years. Who'd learned to tie his shoes in our living room. Who called me Mr. C since he was 8 years old and missing his front teeth. The one who called me at the hospital that first night, voice shaking with what I had assumed was shock and grief. The one who'd visited David exactly once, stayed for 10 minutes while David lay unconscious, and left without explanation or promise to return. "You're lying," I repeated, but my voice had lost its certainty, its surgical precision. The scalpel trembled in my hand, just a micro-tremor, but enough to feel like an earthquake. "Check his phone," Marcus gasped, his eyes wide and pleading. David's phone. The cops never looked at it, right? Check the messages from that night. Jake was texting someone the whole time, even after David went down, even after the ambulance came. I saw him typing while your son was lying on the ground. The scalpel trembled again. For the first time in 23 years of surgery, My hands weren't steady. 36 hours earlier, the police station parking lot was a concrete purgatory where hope went to die. I sat in my BMW, engine off, watching the steady stream of human misery flowing in and out of the building's glass doors. Drug dealers and domestic violence cases, DUI defendants and petty thieves. The endless parade of people whose worst moments had become public record. David's phone charged in my queue folder, the familiar weight of it somehow obscene. How many times had I confiscated this device during David's teenage years? How many dinner table arguments had revolved around screen time and social media and the digital world that seemed more real to my son than the physical one, where families sat together and talked about their days. Detective Morrison had released it that morning with the same bureaucratic indifference she'd shown throughout the investigation. The phone had been evidence for exactly 18 days, sitting in a plastic bag in a forgotten corner of some evidence room, its secrets locked behind a passcode that no one had bothered to crack. No new leads, she'd said, sliding the bag across her desk like a dealer pushing cards. Kids don't talk. Case goes cold unless someone comes forward, and nobody's coming forward. But phones talk, I thought as I connected the device to my car charger. Phones remember everything. Every message, every photo, every moment of digital connection that passes for human interaction in David's generation. The screen lit up with David's lock screen photo, a selfie from last Christmas. David grinning with his arm around Susan, my ex-wife. We'd managed to maintain civility for the holidays, the three of us navigating the careful choreography of divorced family dynamics. David had insisted on the photo, had posted it on Instagram with the caption, "Family Time," and a string of emojis that I didn't understand. Susan had flown in from Portland, where she'd moved after the divorce finalized. 2 years of marriage counseling, 1 year of separation, and 6 months of lawyers had all led to that moment. David beaming between his fractured parents, pretending everything was normal, pretending we were still a family instead of 3 people who shared DNA and complicated histories. David's passcode was our old house number, the one from the suburb where we'd lived before the divorce. Before my late nights at the hospital had driven Susan away, before everything had fractured like poorly healed bone. 5489. Simple. Sentimental. The kind of passcode a son would choose when he wanted to remember when his family was whole. The messages loaded slowly. 3 weeks of digital archaeology revealing themselves line by line. Most were routine plans for nights out, complaints about work, the casual cruelty and careless affection of young men who thought they were immortal. David had been working as a medical scribe while taking pre-med classes, following in his father's footsteps with the determined ambition of someone who'd never quite felt worthy of the family name. His messages revealed the stress of balancing school and work, the pressure of living up to expectations, the weight of being Dr. Chun's son in a small medical community where everyone knew everyone. David, Tuesday, 3:42 p.m. Another double shift at the clinic. Dr. Rodriguez keeps calling me Young Chun, like I'm your clone or something, Jake. Tuesday, 3:45 p.m. At least you're not stuck in retail hell. Had a lady yell at me for 20 minutes because we don't carry size 2 jeans in women's. David. Tuesday, 3:47 p.m. Retail builds character, bro Jake. Tuesday, 3:48 p.m. Retail builds homicidal tendencies. The casual banter revealed nothing. Just 2 friends navigating the tedious reality of post-college life. The grinding routine of working jobs that paid bills without providing purpose. But as I scrolled deeper, patterns began to emerge. David's increasing frustration with school, his resentment of the pressure to follow my path, his growing involvement with a social circle that Jake seemed increasingly uncomfortable. David, Friday, 8:23 p.m. Hitting the club with Tommy and his crew tonight. Jake, Friday, 8:26 p.m. Those guys are trouble, man. Remember what happened last time? David, Friday, 8:28 p.m. That wasn't even a real fight. Just some pushing. Jake. Friday, 8:30 p.m. Tommy literally punched a bouncer. David. Friday, 8:32 p.m. Bouncer had it coming. Stop being so negative. The dismissive tone hung on the screen like an accusation. I had never heard David talk like that. I had never seen him dismiss Jake's concerns so casually. When had my son become someone who called his best friend negative for urging caution? I scrolled forward to the night of the attack, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The messages started innocently enough. Plans to meet at Jake's apartment. Pregamine with cheap vodka and cheaper beer. The ritualistic preparation for a night that was supposed to end with hangovers and embarrassing stories. David. 11:12 p.m. This place is packed. Jake. 11:14 p.m. Can barely hear myself think. David. 11:18 p.m. Tommy says he knows the bouncer. Gonna get us into VIP. Jake. 11:20 p.m. Since when do we need VIP? Thought we were just having drinks. David. 11:25 p.m. Stop being so negative all the time. Then, 20 minutes later, the tone shifted. David. 11:43 p.m. Just called out that whole crew by the bar. LOL. David. 11:44 p.m. Told them they were wannabes who couldn't afford bottle service. David. 11:45 p.m. You see their faces? Priceless. Jake. 11:46 p.m. Dude, maybe chill. David. 11:47 p.m. Whatever, this is our spot now. Tommy says we own this place. David. 11:52 p.m. That one kid looks angry. The skinny one. Jake. 11:53 p.m. We should go. David. 12:01 a.m. Too late, they coming over. The timestamps stopped there. But Jake's messages continued, painting a picture that made my blood turn to ice water. Jake. 12:23 a.m. Cops coming, gotta go. Jake. 12:24 a.m. Sorry, bro. Jake. 12:25 a.m. Tell your dad I'm sorry. I read the last message 17 times, each repetition driving the knife deeper. Tell your dad I'm sorry. Not tell your dad David's hurt. Not tell your dad to come to the hospital. I'm sorry. The kind of sorry you say when you've done something unforgivable. When you failed someone who trusted you. When you've stood by and watched your best friend get severely injured because you were too scared to intervene. When you've run away and left him lying on a nightclub floor. My phone buzzed against my leg, making me jump. A text from Jake Morrison. Hey, Mr. C. Just wanted to check on David. How's he doing? I haven't been able to visit, but thinking about him every day. The casual tone. The careful distance. The lie wrapped in concern. I stared at the message for a long time, my surgeon's mind cataloging implications. Jake hadn't been unable to visit. He'd chosen not to return after that first brief appearance. He'd chosen to maintain distance, to avoid the questions that I was only now learning to ask. I deleted the message without responding and sat in the parking lot until the sun set, reading and rereading David's final messages, trying to understand how my son had become someone I didn't recognize. Present moment. The scalpel clattered to the floor of Marcus Webb's apartment, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I stumbled backward, my perfect surgical composure finally cracking like ice under pressure. The boy on the mattress curled into a fetal position, sobbing with relief, but I barely noticed. My mind was rewriting everything 3 weeks of careful planning, methodical investigation, righteous fury, all of it built on a foundation of lies. Not lies. Something worse. Willful blindness. I'd wanted someone to blame. Someone whose face didn't remind me of Sunday dinners and Little League games and the slow dissolution of my marriage. Someone who wasn't family, who hadn't sat at our kitchen table doing homework while Susan made dinner and I pretended my late nights at the hospital were about saving lives instead of avoiding difficult conversations. Marcus Webb had been the perfect target, a stranger, clearly struggling, easy to demonize. Someone I could hate without complication, could hunt without guilt. Someone who wasn't Jake Morrison, the boy who'd learned to ride a bike in our driveway, who'd cried in my arms when his own father had walked out, who'd been David's best friend for 14 years until the moment David needed him most. "I have to go," I said to Marcus, though I wasn't sure the boy could hear me through his crying. I walked to my car like a man in shock, hands moving automatically, unlock door, turn key, adjust mirrors. The motions of normal life performed by someone who no longer qualified as normal. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a stranger's face, hollow-eyed and haunted, the face of a man who'd spent 3 weeks becoming someone I didn't recognize. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital took 12 minutes through empty streets. I'd made this trip every day for 3 weeks, but tonight the familiar route felt foreign, like driving through someone else's nightmare. The city looked different through the windshield of a man who just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his son was wrong. St. Mary's rose before me like a monument to human frailty, its windows glowing with the harsh fluorescent light that never seemed to sleep. I'd spent half my career within these walls, had delivered hundreds of diagnoses in sterile conference rooms, had performed thousands of procedures in operating theaters that smelled of disinfectant and desperate hope. Now it was just a place where my son lay connected to tubes and wires, his face peaceful in artificial sleep, his future reduced to the steady beep of monitors that measured heartbeats but couldn't measure the distance between fathers and sons. David's room was on the 4th floor, ICU, the place where I had saved hundreds of lives, where I understood the rhythm of machines and the language of medical charts, where I'd learned to read the subtle signs that separated recovery from decline, hope from false hope. The night shift nurse nodded at me as I passed the nurse's station. They all knew me by now. Dr. Chun, whose son was in 447, who visited every day and never caused trouble. They'd learned to give me space, to understand that sometimes doctors made the worst patients' families because they knew too much about everything that could go wrong. I pulled the visitor's chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. The chair was uncomfortable, by design hospital furniture meant to encourage brief visits, not the endless vigils of parents who refused to accept that their presence made no difference to unconscious minds. The scalpel was still in my jacket pocket. I could feel its weight, its potential. For 3 weeks, it had been my purpose, my solution, my way forward. The instrument that would deliver justice when the system failed, that would balance the scales when nothing else could. Now it felt like evidence of my own madness. "The doctors say you might wake up," I said to David's still form, my voice hoarse from 3 weeks of controlled rage finally released. "But you'll be different. Brain damage, motor function problems. You'll need care for the rest of your life." The monitors beeped their electronic lullaby, the sound as familiar as my own heartbeat. I'd heard this rhythm in thousands of rooms, had learned to read hope and despair in the spaces between digital tones. "I've been hunting the wrong people," I continued, the words coming easier now, like confessing to a priest who couldn't grant absolution, looking for someone to blame, someone to punish. "But the truth is ... I stopped, started again. "The truth is you started that fight, didn't you? You pushed those kids until they pushed back. And Jake ran away when you needed him most." I reached out and touched David's hand. It was warm but unresponsive, like touching a mannequin. The skin was soft, unmarked by the violence that had left its signature on David's skull. These were the hands that had once reached for me from a crib, that had gripped my fingers while learning to walk, that had thrown baseballs in our backyard during the summer evenings when our family was still whole. "Oh, it was still whole. I don't know who you really were," I whispered. "I thought I did. I thought I knew my own son, but maybe I was too busy saving other people's children to pay attention to my own." The admission felt like surgery without anesthesia necessary, brutal, transformative. How many nights had I worked late while David ate dinner alone? How many school events had I missed for emergencies that, in retrospect, could have been handled by someone else? How many conversations had I avoided because I was too tired, too stressed, too focused on everything except the boy who'd needed his father to see him clearly? I pulled the scalpel from my pocket and set it on the bedside table. The blade caught the fluorescent light, reflecting my distorted face back at me like a funhouse mirror. For 3 weeks, this instrument had been my compass, pointing toward a vengeance that felt righteous and necessary. Now it just looked like what it had always been, a tool for cutting, for separating healthy tissue from diseased, for making the kinds of precise incisions that could save lives or end them. 23 years of steady hands, 3 weeks of shaking with rage. And now what? The answer came slowly, like consciousness returning after anesthesia, like waking up from a fever dream to find the world fundamentally changed. I wasn't going to use the scalpel on Marcus Webb or Tommy Reeves or even Jake Morrison. I wasn't going to hunt down the boys who'd hurt my son or the friend who'd abandoned him to the consequences of his own choices. I was going to stay here every day, every night if necessary. I was going to learn who David really was, not the idealized version I'd carried in my memory like a photograph kept in a wallet, but the flawed, complicated, sometimes cruel young man who'd made enemies and bad choices and paid a terrible price for both. I was going to be the father I'd never been when David was healthy. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 53 years in my bones. My back ached from too many nights in this chair. My eyes burned from too many hours staring at monitors. My heart felt like it had been surgically removed and replaced with something heavier, something that understood the weight of failure. I walked to the small bathroom attached to David's room, a cramped space that smelled of industrial disinfectant and human desperation. The mirror above the sink showed me what 3 weeks of obsession looked like: hollow cheeks, bloodshot eyes, the kind of haunted expression I'd seen on the faces of patients' families when I delivered news that no one wanted to hear. I turned on the shower and let the water run until steam filled the space. Then I stepped under the spray fully clothed, letting the hot water wash away 3 weeks of sweat and planning and futile rage. My clothes clung to my body like a second skin, and I imagined washing away not just the physical residue of my manhunt, but the spiritual contamination of becoming someone I didn't recognize. The water turned gray at my feet, hospital dust, sleepless nights, the residue of vengeance finally released down the drain. I stood there until the water ran cold, until my skin was pink and raw, until I felt empty enough to begin filling myself with something other than anger. When I emerged, clean and exhausted, David was exactly as I'd left him, breathing steadily, machines beeping, face peaceful in artificial sleep. The room hadn't changed, but I felt like I was seeing it for the first time, not as a crime scene or a monument to injustice, but as simply a place where my son was fighting to survive. I dried myself with hospital towels and put on the spare clothes I'd started keeping in David's room, just in case. Just in case what? I'd never been sure. Now I knew. Just in case, I decided to stop running from the truth. I settled back into the visitor's chair and took David's hand again, feeling the warmth of my son's pulse against my palm. This was what mattered. Not revenge. Not justice. Not the elaborate fantasies of violence I'd constructed to avoid dealing with the simple, terrible reality of a father who'd failed to know his own child. "I'm going to tell you a story," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks, "about a surgeon who thought he could fix everything with his hands, who thought precision and planning could solve any problem, who forgot that some things can't be cut away or sewn back together." The monitors kept their steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat in the electronic twilight of the ICU. "Once upon a time," I began, "there was a father who loved his son so much he almost became a monster." 6 hours later, dawn crept through the hospital window like a reluctant witness, painting David's face in soft gold light that made him look younger, more like the boy I remembered from elementary school plays and soccer games. The harsh fluorescent overhead had given way to natural light, and with it came a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in weeks. I talked through the night stories about David's childhood that I buried under work and disappointment, memories that surfaced like artifacts from an archaeological dig. The time David had tried to perform surgery on his stuffed animals after visiting me at the hospital. The elaborate fort we built in the living room during a snowstorm when David was 8. The long car rides to baseball practice when David had peppered me with questions about medicine, about life, about why people got sick, and whether doctors ever got scared. I told David about the divorce, about the guilt that had driven me deeper into my career like a drug, about the distance that had grown between us like cancer slow at first, then suddenly aggressive. I talked about Susan, about how she'd tried to warn me that I was losing David to my own ambition, and how I dismissed her concerns as the nagging of someone who didn't understand the pressures of saving lives. I told him about Marcus Webb and the scalpel and the terrible clarity that came with abandoning revenge, about the messages on David's phone that had revealed a young man I didn't recognize, someone capable of cruelty and casual violence that felt foreign to everything I'd thought I knew about my son. The hardest part had been reading those messages aloud, each text a small revelation, each timestamp a moment when I had failed to understand who my son was becoming. David's increasing arrogance, his casual dismissal of people he deemed beneath him, his growing appetite for confrontation, all of it documented in digital detail that couldn't be denied or explained away. Told them they were wannabes who couldn't afford bottle service. I had read, my voice cracking on the words. When did you become someone who talked like that? When did you start measuring people's worth by their bank accounts? I talked about Susan, about the phone call that had shattered me more than any of the medical updates. She'd driven up from Portland the day after the attack, had sat in this same chair with tears streaming down her face, and said the words that still echoed in my mind. I tried to tell you, she'd whispered. I tried to warn you that he was changing, that the pressure to be your son was turning him into someone we didn't recognize. But you were always at the hospital, always saving someone else's child while ours slipped away. The accusation had landed like a diagnosis of terminal illness accurate, devastating, and completely beyond my ability to treat. Susan had seen what I'd missed, had tried to bridge the growing gap between father and son while I performed surgery after surgery, saved life after life, collected accolades and professional respect while my own family dissolved around me. I told David about the night of his graduation from medical school, how proud I had been, how I'd introduced my son to every colleague as the future Dr. Chun. David had smiled and shaken hands and played the part perfectly, but I could see now that it had been a performance. Even then, David had been struggling with the weight of expectations that I had placed on his shoulders without asking if he wanted to carry them. I made you into a reflection of my own ambitions. I had confessed to the unconscious form. Instead of asking what you wanted to be, I assumed you wanted to be me. And when you started becoming someone else, someone harder, angrier, I told myself it was just a phase, that you grow out of it. The memories kept coming, each one more painful than the last. David's increasing absences from family dinners, the way he'd started treating service workers with casual contempt, the fights with Susan that I had dismissed as typical mother-son conflict, never recognizing them as Susan's desperate attempts to save David from becoming someone we wouldn't recognize. Your mother tried to tell me you were hanging out with the wrong crowd, I had said. She said Tommy Reeves was a bad influence, but Jake was getting scared of the person you were becoming. I told her she was overreacting. I said boys would be boys, that you needed to sow your wild oats before settling down to the serious business of medical school. The irony was crushing. I'd been so focused on preserving David's future that I'd ignored David's present, so concerned with my son's professional development that I'd missed his moral deterioration. I treated David's character like a surgical outcome, something that would inevitably improve with time and proper intervention, rather than something that required daily attention and constant care. "I thought I was giving you space to grow," I had whispered. "I thought the worst thing I could do was micromanage your choices. So I stepped back and let you make your own decisions. I let you drift away from everything I thought I taught you about kindness, about treating people with respect, about being better than your worst impulses. Most importantly, I told him about forgiveness, not the easy kind that erased responsibility, but the hard kind that acknowledged fault and chose love anyway, the kind that admitted mistakes without demanding absolution, that accepted consequences without wallowing in self-pity. I forgive you for becoming someone I didn't recognize," I had said, "and I forgive myself for failing to see it happening. But more than that, I forgive you for being human, for being 22 and stupid and full of testosterone and bad decisions, for wanting to be someone other than who I expected you to be." Dr. Martinez knocked on the door at 7 a.m., making her morning rounds with the efficient compassion that marked the best physicians. She paused when she saw me still sitting beside the bed, David's hand in mine, and something in her expression suggested she understood more than she was saying. "You've been here all night," she observed, checking David's chart with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read family dynamics as clearly as medical data. "Yes, you need rest, food, a shower." I almost smiled, remembering the steam-filled bathroom, the clothes still drying on the radiator. I already had the shower. As for the rest, I squeezed David's fingers gently, feeling for any response that might indicate awareness beneath the artificial peace. I'm exactly where I need to be. Dr. Martinez moved around the bed with practiced grace, checking David's pupils with the penlight, testing reflexes that might signal the return of consciousness. Her movements were precise, economical, and I recognized in them the same surgical precision I had once brought to my own practice. "Any changes overnight?" she asked, though we both knew she would have been alerted immediately if David's condition had shifted. "No," I said, "but I think that's okay. Change will come when it comes, or it won't. Either way, I'll be here." She nodded and moved toward the door, then stopped with the kind of hesitation that suggested carefully considered words. "Dr. Chun, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." After she left, I leaned back in the uncomfortable visitor's chair and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, I wasn't ready for that yet, but to listen. To the machines that measured my son's life in electronic pulses. To the hospital waking up around, us nurses beginning their shifts, doctors making rounds, families gathering to face another day of hoping and waiting and loving in the face of uncertainty. To the sound of my own breathing, finally steady again. The scalpel still lay on the bedside table, but it looked different now. Not like a weapon or a solution, or a promise of justice delayed. Just like what it had always been, a tool for healing, misused by a man who'd forgotten that some wounds couldn't be closed with surgical precision. I opened my eyes and looked at my son's peaceful face, searching for traces of the boy I'd known and the young man I'd failed to understand. David's features were relaxed in unconsciousness, free from the stress and anger that had marked our recent interactions. This was David at rest, David without the weight of expectations and disappointments, David simply being. "Today I'm going to learn about physical therapy," I said, my voice carrying a promise that felt more substantial than all my elaborate plans for revenge, "and speech therapy, and all the things we'll need to know when you wake up. Because you will wake up, David. And when you do, I'm going to be right here." I paused, considering my next words carefully, weighing them with the precision I'd once reserved for surgical instruments. Not to fix you, not to change what happened, just to love you, the real you, whatever that means. The morning light grew stronger, painting David's face in soft gold that made him look peaceful, almost ethereal. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sounds of the hospital coming alive, nurses beginning their shifts with coffee and quiet conversations. Doctors making rounds with measured steps and practiced compassion. Families gathering in waiting rooms to face another day of hoping and waiting and loving in the face of medical uncertainty. It was the sound of life continuing, of people finding ways to care for each other despite the clinical sterility of institutional medicine. It was the sound of healing that happened not through dramatic intervention, but through simple persistence, through showing up day after day until showing up became its own form of grace. It was also the sound of second chances, of families learning to love each other despite their failures and disappointments. I thought about Susan, still important, still carrying the weight of a marriage that had failed because both partners had forgotten how to prioritize each other over their individual ambitions. She deserved a phone call, an apology, a conversation about how we might rebuild something from the ruins of what we'd lost. I thought about Jake Morrison, probably lying awake at night with the weight of his cowardice eating at him like acid. Jake deserved forgiveness too. Not for David's sake, but for his own. I understood now that carrying the burden of failing someone you love was a form of torture that no 22-year-old should have to endure alone. I'm going to call Jake today, I said to David's still form. Not to forgive him, that's not mine to give, but to tell him that I understand why he ran, that I probably would have done the same thing at his age. That being scared doesn't make him evil, just human. The words felt strange in my mouth, but right in my heart. For 3 weeks, I'd carried the poisonous weight of hatred and the need for revenge. It had been easier than carrying the weight of love and disappointment, easier than accepting that the people we care about most are capable of devastating us in ways we never see coming. Your mother was right about a lot of things, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each admission. She said I worked too much because it was easier than being present for the hard conversations. She said I treated our family like patients, problems to be diagnosed and solved rather than people to be known and loved. She said I was raising you to be a successful doctor instead of helping you become a good man. The monitors continued their electronic symphony, measuring life in digital increments that couldn't capture the complexity of human relationships or the difficulty of being a parent in a world that offered no instruction manual for raising decent people. I'm going to be different when you wake up, I promised. Not perfect. I'm 53 years old and set in my ways, but different. I'm going to ask you questions about who you want to be instead of telling you who I think you should become. I'm going to listen to your answers, even if they scare me. I'm going to love the person you actually are instead of the person I imagined you could be. These weren't easy promises to make. They required me to fundamentally reimagine my relationship with control, with expectations, with the surgical precision I'd applied to every aspect of my life. They required me to accept that some things couldn't be fixed, only endured and transformed through the patient application of love over time. I'm going to learn about the things you're interested in that have nothing to do with medicine, I said. Your music, your books, your opinions about politics and sports, and whatever else matters to you. I'm going to try to understand why you chose Tommy Reeves and his crew over safer friends, what you were looking for that Jake couldn't provide. The hardest promise was still coming. The one that would require me to surrender the last vestiges of my need to control my son's trajectory. And if you decide you don't want to be a doctor, I'm going to support that decision, even if it disappoints me, even if it means admitting that I raised you with expectations that were more about my ego than your happiness. I'm going to help you figure out who you want to be, even if that person is nothing like who I wanted you to become. The room felt different after I spoke those words, lighter somehow, as if the weight of unspoken expectations had been pressing down on us, both without either of us realizing it. I had spent David's entire life preparing him for a future that David might not have wanted, pushing him toward goals that I had chosen without consultation or consideration for David's own dreams and ambitions. "We're going to start over," I said, squeezing David's hand with a gentleness that felt foreign after weeks of rage and violence. Father and son, but also just two people learning to know each other without all the assumptions and expectations that got in our way before. "It's going to be harder than surgery, messier than any medical procedure I've ever performed. But it's also going to be more important than anything I've ever done." The morning light continued to strengthen, painting the room in shades of gold and possibility. I could hear my colleagues beginning their rounds in other parts of the hospital, could imagine them reviewing charts and discussing treatment plans with the same clinical precision I'd once brought to my own practice. But I was no longer part of that world, at least not in the same way. My practice would continue. My patients would be cared for, but my priorities had shifted in ways that felt both terrifying and necessary. I, who had spent 23 years believing that steady hands could solve any problem, finally understood that some things couldn't be cut away or sewn back together. Some wounds healed through time and presence, through the patient accumulation of small kindnesses that added up to something larger than their individual parts. The hardest surgery wasn't performed with scalpels and sutures. It was performed with patience and presence, with the willingness to sit with uncertainty and discomfort, with the courage to love someone even when you didn't understand them, even when they disappointed you, even when they became someone you never expected them to be. But they could be accepted, they could be forgiven, they could be loved. Outside David's window, the city woke up to another ordinary morning commuters heading to jobs they didn't love, students trudging to classes they'd rather skip, families navigating the complex choreography of modern life with its endless demands and expectations. But inside room 447, a father sat beside his son's bed and discovered that the hardest surgery of all was the one you performed on your own heart. The careful removal of resentment and disappointment, the delicate reconstruction of love in its purest form. The scalpel remained on the table, unused and unnecessary, a reminder of how close I'd come to destroying everything that mattered in service of a justice that would have solved nothing and healed no one. After all, some wounds heal better when you stop trying to fix them and simply learn to live with the scars they leave behind. Some relationships are saved not through dramatic intervention, but through the quiet revolution of choosing love over anger, presence over perfection, acceptance over control. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, counting heartbeats and breaths, measuring the slow return of a young man who would wake up to find a father who finally understood that love wasn't about surgical precision or perfect outcomes. It was about showing up, staying present, and accepting that the messiest, most imperfect relationships were often the most worth saving. Thank you for staying with me and listening this far. Your attention is a gift. Did these minutes mean something to you? Then please follow the channel. Every click from you is a push. That helps me keep bringing stories that truly stay with us.